All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back from the poster session. We're really excited for our 2 afternoon sessions of research talks. This first session I like to think of as really highlighting both the breadth and the depth of research that's going on at Penn State in the area of substance use and addiction. So we've got, bench to bedside to family to individual. So this is sort of our breadth session. And first up, I'd like to welcome Dr. Alice Zhang to present on access and utilization of harm reduction supplies from smart vending machines in Pennsylvania.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I am excited to be talking about our harm reduction vending machines that we have in place. And so these are our Health to Go vending machines. As you can tell, at its heart, it is a vending machine that dispenses items. But we also have an interactive touchscreen in the front, which I'll talk about later, allows us to do a lot of advanced data collection as well as some interactive features as well. And so within our vending machine, we're able to offer a variety of items for free. We have harm reduction items, which includes naloxone by itself and also within the kit with a CPR face shield. We have drug checking strips, and we have recently added in medetomidine checking strips given the new drug supply. And we also have wound care kits as well. We're also able to offer basic needs items, so hygiene kits, menstrual supplies, and in addition, we are also able to offer sexual and reproductive health items such as pregnancy tests, HIV self-tests, and safer sex items as well. And all of this is for free. As mentioned, we have an interactive touchscreen, which makes our vending machine a little bit fancier than the typical. And in addition, our vending machines are connected to cellular and Wi-Fi connection. So the combination of the two allows us to play customized videos on the screen. And so if you look to the right, we have a video of how to use drug checking strips so that people can educate themselves on how to use it properly. We're also able to list services and resources in the area, both in a map form and a list form, so people get connected to treatment and services. And we're also able to collect data from how people interact with the vending machines. We're also able to ask survey questions through the vending machine as well. So it does allow for a lot of rich data collection through the vending machines. We do have folks create a username when they use the vending machine, and this enables us to track users throughout time and kind of see how they use the vending machine, what items they get, and kind of capture additional information over time. Finally, we're able to provide real-time alerts through the vending machine and also provide some public health messaging on the screen as well. We currently have 4 vending machines. Our first 2 were placed 2 years ago in Harrisburg, which is outside an emergency department, and in Reading, inside a YMCA. We just launched 2 more vending machines, one in Millersburg, which is our rural location. And then in a couple of days, we'll be doing a soft launch of our vending machine in York, which is outside a community health center. And so today I'll be talking about the access and utilization of harm reduction supplies, specifically from our vending machines, focusing on the 2 that have been in place for the past 2 years. So basically, are people getting harm reduction items from the vending machines? And if so, how are they using these supplies? And so we did mixed methods using quantitative data from the vending machine data itself, also the survey questions that we asked through the vending machines, in addition to some qualitative interviews that we did with vending machine users. So over the past 2 years, from the 2 vending machines, we've dispensed over 8,400 harm reduction items. And between the 2 vending machines in Harrisburg and Reading, there have been some differences in terms of how much is dispensed, with the Harrisburg machine dispensing a little bit more of the naloxone and drug checking strips, and Reading a little bit more of the wound care kits. But this is not just a few people getting these items. Nearly half of the vending machine users obtain these harm reduction items. As for why people are getting naloxone, over 1/3 are getting it so that they can have it on hand in case they witness an overdose. And this was consistent with qualitative interviews as well, which emphasized the unpredictability of an overdose, or just wanting to be prepared in the event they encountered somebody having an overdose. And so these quotes emphasize that they always just have it on hand. You never know when they walk and they might be experiencing somebody having an overdose. Interestingly enough, the survey data also revealed that about 20% were obtaining naloxone so that someone else could give it to them if they themselves happened to overdose. And while the interviews didn't highlight this aspect, our vending machine data did show that 43% of the vending machine users in the past 12 months had an overdose requiring naloxone. So this naloxone is reaching individuals who may be at risk as well. For those obtaining drug checking strips from the vending machine, many were worried about what was in the drug supply, with some also wanting to give it to others that they knew who would benefit. And there were also some who were concerned of wanting to avoid an accidental overdose. And our qualitative interviews similarly highlighted these aspects. A lot of them focused on fentanyl testing strips. This one individual wanted to make sure they weren't getting fentanyl because they were not interested in using that substance. This individual was getting them to distribute to friends who they knew were using heroin, and they wanted them to be safe. And this individual, too, had overdosed in the past because of fentanyl that was in their drug supply. And so she was obtaining this to make sure that they would avoid an overdose in the future. And many of the vending machine users also experienced in terms of getting the harm reduction items in the past. Our survey data showed that over half had obtained naloxone in the past. And similarly, the qualitative interviews highlighted this aspect as well, of needing to use it on someone and it being relatively self-explanatory and easy to do so. Similarly, with the drug checking strips, more than half had reported using drug checking strips in the past. But our interviews did highlight the aspect that not many knew exactly how to use it, with this one individual saying that they were Googling and YouTubing it because the directions in our product weren't actually useful. And then the individual on the other side as well, the quote there, saying that they actually watched the video on the vending machine touchscreen on how to use the drug checking strips, likely because this is a relatively new-ish addition to the harm reduction landscape. As for reasons why people are choosing to get naloxone from a vending machine specifically, convenience was a major factor, in addition to their usual place for getting naloxone being either too far away or closed at the time. And this was concordant with our qualitative interviews as well, with people highlighting convenience being a huge aspect. So this individual saying that with the vending machine, you don't really talk to anybody. You can walk up, get what you need, you can answer any questions, because otherwise sometimes people pry and ask what they need, what you need is for. And they did also highlight the privacy aspect as well within the interviews, which didn't come up as much in the survey data. And so this individual mentioned the privacy aspect. Nobody wants to walk up to someone and say, "Hey, excuse me, can I get a Narcan?" Like, I don't want other people knowing I'm in addiction. So those are certainly some aspects of the vending machine that was beneficial for these individuals. Finally, our data showed underlying attitudes towards harm reduction and substance use. Our survey data showed that more than half of the vending machine users thought the vending machine could help reduce stigma about naloxone and towards substance use as well. And our qualitative interviews showed, I guess, some mixed findings as well. There were some individuals who really had a strong endorsement of the harm reduction items, saying that they're saving individuals from overdosing, saving people from dying, saving people from infections. But there was also a good number of individuals who had some mixed feelings about the supplies. This individual on the side said that they believe in Narcan, but they don't believe in the test strips, as they perceive it as kind of enabling behaviors. So we kind of got some of the mixed feelings about some of the harm reduction items as well. So the key takeaways from the data we obtained, smart vending machines can be a low barrier, non-stigmatizing method for distributing harm reduction items in the community. They obviously offer some certain benefits, including being convenient, privacy, and potentially stigma reduction as well. And individuals who do get the drug checking strips often make rational decisions based on the results of that, contrary to what some may perceive about people who use drugs. And future harm reduction items, of course, pending legislation, will need to be carefully implemented with community education and outreach. Some of our interviews did highlight, as mentioned, some, mixed opinions about the value of harm reduction items as well. I just want to give a great thank you to all the partners who have helped to make this happen, both within Penn State and also externally as well, and also our funding sources as well. So thank you very much.
We'll do questions at the end of the session. So our next presenter is Makenna Luzenski, who's going to present on perinatal substance exposure and maternal distress, direct and indirect associations with toddler outcomes via maternal intrusiveness.
Oh, okay. I get to two-hand. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So yes, I'm Makenna. I'm a first-year graduate student studying developmental psychology with Dr. Rena Iden. So I'm just going to be presenting some findings from my first-year project today. So thank you all for being here. Okay, so to start, the work of my project is based in the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, or DOHAD framework, which highlights the importance of the perinatal period, which is the prenatal to immediate postnatal period, as having lifelong consequences for socio-emotional development. So under a very basic overview of the theory here is that exposure to fetal stress promotes fetal adaptation to stressful environments. So when we relate this to substance exposure can be a specific stressor that can have direct teratological influence on fetal development. Tobacco and cannabis are two of the most frequently used substances during pregnancy, with an estimated 14.9% of pregnant individuals reporting using tobacco in the last month. So there's a large wealth of literature that connects tobacco exposure during this period to later externalizing types of outcomes in young children, such as conduct disorder. But the mechanisms linking these types of perinatal exposures to toddler or child outcomes is relatively unclear. Likewise, as we all know, the increasing rates of legalization and access to cannabis within the US show that past month cannabis use amongst pregnant individuals in the US increased by 105% from 2002 to 2017. And strikingly, co-use is much more common in pregnant individuals than cannabis use alone. So we're seeing more folks using tobacco and cannabis together. Pregnant individuals also increasingly perceive cannabis use to be a safe alternative for reducing or managing pregnancy-related symptoms, yet the effects of this perinatal exposure to cannabis are really unknown. So maternal substance use, which includes tobacco and cannabis exposure, is frequently a marker of additional co-occurring contextual risk factors, such as psychological distress and socioeconomic deprivation or victimization. And psychological distress, the way that I'm defining it today, can be measured through greater depressive symptoms and experiences of anger, hostility, and aggression during this perinatal period. So pregnant individuals who experience psychological distress from and in addition to these contextual risk factors may be using substances like tobacco and cannabis as a means of coping with and managing their distress and dysregulation during this time period. And then the stress and these feelings can also be a form of direct environmental stress on the developing fetus. So perinatal maternal tobacco and cannabis use and these co-occurring psychological distress may increase the risk for children's emotional and regulatory problems, either directly by increasing their biological vulnerability, Or it may increase the risk for children's emotional and regulatory problems indirectly through proximal effects on parent-child interactions. So disruptions in sensitive, responsive parenting behaviors, which we define as when parents are responding warmly and responsively to child, or like in this case, infant cues, they can be disrupted due to substance use and psychological distress. And these types of adaptive parenting behaviors can be especially difficult for mothers who have continued active substance use into this early childhood period. So in these instances, the parenting that infants are experiencing may actually be more promotive of behavioral problems in their development rather than adaptive outcomes. So of particular interest to my study today is intrusive parenting behaviors. And intrusive parenting behaviors include physical and verbal behaviors that subvert a child's initiative or autonomy and can involve excessive stimulation or direction towards the child. And due to impinging upon young children's burgeoning internalization of regulatory skills, intrusive parenting behaviors may disrupt the adaptive child development during this stage. So now that we're situated within this theoretical and conceptual framework, I can state my hypotheses. So we hypothesize that perinatal substance exposure and maternal psychological distress would be directly associated with greater toddler socio-emotional and behavior problems, but also that this association would be mediated by the intrusive parenting behaviors that infants would experience. So now I can describe our sample. So the study leverages longitudinal data collected from the Growing Up Healthy study, which it consists of 247 mother-child dyads who were oversampled for tobacco cannabis exposure during pregnancy. So mothers were recruited during their first perinatal visit, and a majority of mothers at this time were young, diverse, low income, single or non-cohabitating with their partners, and were largely receiving government assistance. Mothers in this study were also excluded if they had any other forms of illicit substance use or if they were drinking heavy amounts of alcohol. We also had mothers without substance use who were demographically matched on age and education to the mothers who were reporting substance use during this time period. So now I'll walk us through the measures for this study. This looks like a lot, so we'll break it down a little bit. But to start, we can go through our measures of substance exposure during the perinatal period. So in this study, I ended up using reports from mothers from the semi-structured timeline follow-back interview, which mothers reported on their cigarette and joint use per day throughout the perinatal period and 2 months postpartum. And an additional strength that this project has is that we did have biomarker confirmation of substance use through maternal saliva samples and infant meconium, which is the first stool passed after delivery. And while I didn't use them in analyses, what we know from literature is that moms are more likely, or just individuals using substances are more likely to accurately report their substance use when they know that there will be biomarker confirmation. So that's one of the benefits of being able to use this continuous measure of substance use in this period. But as always, the use in this study is more general, as a general estimate, and especially when we're measuring cannabis, there is a lot of measurement error that's involved in this. And because the mother-child dyads were recruited from 2006 to 2010, we're limited a little bit in that our measures of the substance exposure are really just combustible, conventional cigarettes and joints, and we don't have access to data with like vaping or other modes of cannabis use that are more common now. But with that, I can describe the rest of the measures. So mothers then reported on their depressive symptoms and their anger, hostility, and aggression across these perinatal periods. And then at 9 months, maternal intrusiveness was observationally coded from mother-child free play sessions. And then finally, our outcome variable of interest was toddler behavior problems at 16 months. So these were measured from the brief infant toddler social emotional assessment. And we were looking at 3 types of like more maladaptive behaviors at this stage. The first was internalizing behaviors, which for toddlers at this stage would be like more fear and sadness and shyness or withdrawal. And then externalizing behaviors, which for toddlers is more aggression, more anger, or like acting out. And then their dysregulated behavior problems, which are more like they have a strong reaction to stress, so they have like higher reactivity, but then they also have a hard time regulating downward after experiencing stress or frustration or something like that. So those are the types of outcomes that we were looking at. And perinatal composite variables were, perinatal composite variables were computed for or by averaging the measures across these perinatal time points from like the first trimester for some into the 2 months postpartum. And all these measures within themselves were highly correlated with each other across time points and stable. And then the actual perinatal risk measures from substance exposure to the depressive symptoms and anger, hostility, and aggression were also all correlated with each other. So now I can bring us to the overall model. So path analysis indicated that our mediational model fit the data well. On the graph here, the solid lines that I have are our significant pathways. The dashed lines are marginally significant pathways, and then I didn't report non-significant paths. But just as a note also, we included gestational age, duration of breastfeeding, and maternal years of education as covariates within our analysis, so they're like accounted for within this model as well. But now I can break it down a little bit so it's a little bit more digestible for everybody. So this is looking at the direct paths that we analyzed within the model. And as you can see, the higher perinatal depressive symptoms were associated with greater toddler internalizing, externalizing, and dysregulated behavior problems at 16 months. But we're also seeing this direct effect of greater perinatal cannabis use being associated with greater toddler externalizing problems or behavior problems at 16 months as well. And here, getting into some of the indirect paths. So we actually did not see maternal intrusive behaviors mediating this association between perinatal risks and toddler outcomes. But what's unexpected is that mothers who did smoke more cigarettes per day in the perinatal period were reported displaying fewer intrusive parenting behaviors at 9 months interactions. And we see here that there was greater intrusiveness from mothers who were smoking cannabis during this perinatal period. So some differential findings per the substances. So what does this all mean? The biggest thing is that our findings add to the relatively small literature on cannabis exposure and supports evidence that cannabis can interfere with interpersonal processes. And we're seeing this both in the greater intrusiveness for mothers who are reporting cannabis use in infancy, but then also in the effects of externalizing problems for these young toddlers. The results also highlight the importance of co-occurring perinatal depressive symptoms for toddler outcomes, as this was our strongest and primary direct predictor variable of toddler outcomes. And finally, the findings also indicate that mothers may be using tobacco to regulate their behaviors during parent-child interactions prior to this perinatal period, or prior to around 9 months during the perinatal period. And this is based off of the finding that we're seeing fewer intrusiveness for mothers who are using substances in the months leading up to infancy. So what that can mean, and something we can look at, is that cigarettes may be a primary means of coping for mothers who are experiencing all of these co-occurring risk factors. And this suggests that there might be a need for providing better coping strategies for this population broadly. Also, future work can look to assess dose-response effects of tobacco and cannabis, so we can see if there's a certain dosage or amount of cannabis exposure that might be leading to different levels of externalizing problems in young toddlers, or vice versa. But then finally, what really I want to look at in my future work going forward is the idea of heterogeneity in our findings, as we know that not all children who are experiencing these types of or are experiencing exposures are experiencing maladaptive outcomes. So our future work can assess protective factors or ways of targeting interventions to help these families and these young children. So in the future work, I plan to look at parenting behaviors as a potential moderating factor within this model. Since we weren't really seeing mediation, it may be that some children who are exposed to substances during the perinatal or prenatal period may be better responsive to more sensitive parenting behaviors or respond differently to these more maladaptive behaviors. But also that there might be child factors like temperament or reactivity that might either promote further risk for these later toddler outcomes or just generally could be protective, even if there are exposures to substances and co-occurring stressors. So with that, I want to say thank you. And thank you to my wonderful advisor, Rena, and my lab and everyone who helps to make this work possible, and to the families and all of our research staff throughout the years. So thank you.
All right. Next up, we've got Cole Moran-Bariso presenting on acute treatment with Tirzepatide, reduces Q, drug, and stress-induced fentanyl seeking in male rats. I'm excited to see this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Cole Moran-Bariso. I'm a research technologist in the Nylon Lab over at the College of Medicine. And this is my talk titled Acute Treatment with Tirzepatide Reduces Q, Drug, and Stress-Induced Fentanyl Seeking in Male Rats. So, opioid use disorder is a chronic relapsing condition which affects an individual's brain and behavior, resulting in uncontrolled opioid use. It was declared an epidemic in the United States in 2017, with nearly 80,000 opioid-related deaths in the United States in 2023. And as you can see here from this figure on the right side, the rise in opioid-related deaths coincides with the significant use of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. You can see that with that purple trend line there as well. And you can also see a sharp spike right around 2020 where we had that COVID lockdown happen. So current treatments. In 2022, amongst US adults aged 18 years and up who needed opioid use disorder treatment, only 25.1% of these individuals actually received medications for opioid use disorder. Now, current treatments include drugs such as buprenorphine, naltrexone, and methadone. However, there are currently no non-opioid treatments available for opioid use disorder. And previous research has shown that satiety-inducing agents have reduced the response to reward-driven behaviors in rats, and GLP-1 receptor agonist treatments have been used to reduce craving and seeking behavior in rats with drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, with GLP-1 agonists such as exendin-4, liraglutide, and semaglutide. So what is the GLP-1 pathway? Well, GLP-1 is a satiety molecule, and to be more specific, GLP-1 is an incretin hormone produced in the L cells of the small intestine, typically released in response to food rewards in order to reduce the reward-seeking behavior for those food rewards. It's also worth noting that there are many GLP-1 receptors throughout the body, including in the brain as well. So GLP-1 is a satiety molecule released in order to reduce reward-seeking behaviors by the brain and the body. In this case, we use Tirzepatide, which is a combined GLP-1, GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide agonist, which has become available for the treatment of diabetes and obesity. It's administered using a subcutaneous injection with a half-life of approximately 120 hours or 5 days. And the addition of the GIP agonist has increased efficacy for weight loss, along with having some possible emetic effects to help the positive emetic effects there. However, there are currently no data assessing the effects of GLP-1 GIP dual agonists on opioid addiction or opioid use disorder. So we set up a self-administration paradigm using 24 male Sprague-Dawley rats who underwent jugular vein catheterization surgeries, followed by 2 days of water training habituation where the animals learned to click an active spout in order to receive a reward. The animals then underwent a 14-day acquisition at 6 hours per day where they were able to readily self-administer fentanyl at 1.85 micrograms per infusion with a volume of 0.2 milliliters per infusion by clicking an active spout underneath a Q light with a fixed ratio of 10 contacts in order to receive a fentanyl infusion. So the animals were able to readily self-administer as much fentanyl as they wanted over the course of 6 hours per day for 14 consecutive days. Following that 14-day period, the animals underwent a 12-hour pretreatment with either Tirzepatide or saline before going in for a Q and drug-induced seeking test day. Now, this test day is important because the Qs here represent a craving response for individuals who might be experiencing opioid use disorder or some kind of substance use disorder. And the drug here represents that relapse model that we're looking at. Now, following that first test day, all of the animals undergo 1 week of total drug abstinence before undergoing one more 12-hour pretreatment with either Tirzepatide or saline prior to going in for a stress-induced reinstatement test day. The stress part here is important because individuals who are experiencing opioid use disorder or some kind of substance use disorder have a higher probability for relapse under stressful conditions. So this is our self-administration paradigm here. Now we're hypothesizing that rats treated with 0.05 mg per kg Tirzepatide will exhibit significant weight loss compared to saline controls, along with reduced Q-induced fentanyl-seeking behavior, reduced stress-induced fentanyl-seeking behavior, along with reduced drug-induced fentanyl-seeking behavior. So what did we see? Well, first we were able to show that 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide is sufficient to reduce body weight in our animals, as the 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide caused significant weight loss compared to saline controls for both our drug-induced reinstatement test day along with our stress-induced reinstatement test day. Now for our figures here, we have our treatment groups on the x-axis with tirzepatide on the left side of the figures in green and saline on the right side of the figures in blue. And on the y-axis, we have a % change in body weight. The error bars here represent standard error of the mean. And we're showing here that 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide was sufficient to reduce body weight in our animals. The next thing we observed was individual differences in drug taking. Now, we're seeing that some individual rats were taking as low as 2 infusions per day, and other individual rats were taking up to 100 or 126 infusions in a single 6-hour acquisition period. Again, we have acquisition day on the x-axis here, the number of infusion attempts over a 6-hour period represented on the y-axis. We saw this individual differences in drug taking and decided to perform a median split to separate drug takers into high drug taker groups and low drug taker groups, which you're seeing on the right side here. The high drug takers are depicted by the red trend line with the red triangles. And you can see that throughout the 14-day acquisition, they're pretty much having a steady increase in their drug taking over time, whereas the low drug takers are sitting about around 20 infusions over their 6-hour acquisition period. So we have a nice separation between high drug takers and low drug takers, representing some individual differences in drug taking. Now, the one thing that I would note here is that we did not observe any significant differences between the high drug taker groups or the low drug taker groups when we did our test day. So that's why here, our first test day, we have the tirzepatide and saline groups just combined. So we're showing here the tirzepatide reduces Q and drug-induced seeking in our rats, as the 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide reduced fentanyl seeking as elicited by Qs in our first hour and by drug in our last hour. Now, let me walk you through this a little bit. So we have a 4-hour test day. So time is represented on the x-axis. The number of infusion attempts over that test day is on the y-axis. All of our animals here have a previous history of fentanyl self-administration. So they should have a fair amount of seeking, especially during this first hour where they're exposed to all of their typical drug-related cues. So all of their previously established drug-related cues are active during this first hour. We should be seeing a significant amount of drug seeking, but what we're seeing here with the tirzepatide group is a significant reduction in their drug seeking as compared to the saline controls. We can see that with a significantly lower number of infusion attempts during that first hour. Now at hour 3, we give all of our animals one single infusion of fentanyl to elicit a drug-induced seeking response. And what we're seeing here in this last hour is that the tirzepatide group have a significant reduction in their fentanyl seeking. And in fact, the tirzepatide group as a whole pretty much stopped seeking for drug, whereas the saline group all reverted to seeking for drug in that last hour there. So we're showing here tirzepatide reduced Q and drug-induced seeking as 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide reduced fentanyl seeking as elicited by their drug-related cues in that first hour and by drug in that last hour. And for our second test day, this is the stress test day, we're showing that tirzepatide reduced stress-induced fentanyl seeking as the 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide reduced their stress-induced fentanyl seeking in that last hour. So similarly, we have a 4-hour test day with infusion attempts on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. One thing to note here is that prior to going into their stress-induced seeking test day on this day, they had that 1 week of drug abstinence. So there was likely a lot of stress for the animals going into this day, which is why during that first hour, there's no significance in their Q-induced seeking, despite there being all of their drug-related cues active during that time. So at hour 3 for this test day, instead of receiving a fentanyl infusion, they receive an infusion of yohimbine, which induces a stress-like response in our animals to elicit that stress-induced seeking response. And again, what we're seeing here is the tirzepatide group have a significant reduction in their fentanyl seeking as compared to those saline controls. We can see that again with the tirzepatide group have a significant reduction in their number of infusion attempts during that last hour compared to the saline controls. So 0.05 mg per kg tirzepatide was also able to reduce stress-induced fentanyl seeking. Now, in conclusion, a low dose 0.05 mg per kg of tirzepatide reduced Q, drug, and stress-induced fentanyl seeking in male rats. We observed significant weight loss compared to saline controls, significant effects on Q-induced fentanyl seeking behavior, significant effects on drug-induced fentanyl seeking behavior, along with significant effects on stress-induced fentanyl seeking behavior. In the future, we'd like to explore sex differences using our tirzepatide and fentanyl self-administration paradigm. along with collecting some rat brains to perform RT-qPCR for neural analysis, and possibly doing some kaolin consumption studies to assess the possible emetic effects at 0.05 mg per kg, along with doing some rotarod testing to assess the locomotor function at 0.05 mg per kg. With that, I would like to thank my lab members in the Nyland lab and Grigson lab, along with our funding from the NIH. We have no conflicts of interest to disclose. Thank you.
That's great. All right. And now our fourth presentation is Rachel Marcus, who will be presenting on developmental cascades from prenatal substance exposure to adolescent substance use, the roles of parenting, self-regulation, and early adversity.
Everybody, good afternoon. My name is Rachel, and I'm a fifth-year developmental psych PhD student, also in Dr. Rena Iden's lab. Sorry. All right, so to start off, prenatal cocaine exposure may increase the risk for adolescent substance use through a variety of different processes that include effects on fetal brain development and alterations in areas involving regulation of arousal and reward processes. But the literature linking prenatal cocaine exposure to adolescent substance use has been mixed, with some studies reporting higher substance use among cocaine-exposed adolescents and other studies reporting no direct associations. However, there have only been a few studies that have examined potential mechanisms within a developmental framework. In addition, prenatal cocaine use often co-occurs with other substance use, which may pose additional risk. So that brings us to our starting point. How does prenatal cocaine use and other substance exposure increase the risk for adolescent substance use? And to start, why does substance use even matter? We know that substance use experimentation in adolescence is normative, but the timing and frequency matters a lot. Earlier initiation is linked to a greater lifetime rate of substance use disorder, and later adolescent initiation is associated with a faster time between initiation to diagnose substance use disorder. So, understanding the predictors of early initiation and higher use is meaningful. And most adolescent research overall has used normative low adversity samples, leading to uncertainty about how results can generalize to families with prenatal substance exposure and early adversity. There may be different causal mechanisms in high-risk environments, adding to the need for longitudinal studies. And so to address these gaps, this study is going to use a sample that was recruited at birth and followed all the way until the end of adolescence, using a matched design for prenatal cocaine exposed and non-prenatal cocaine exposed groups, and used repeated multi-method assessments in a high-risk sample. So we just examined a developmental cascade model that spanned the prenatal period all the way to late adolescence, including key predictors of developmentally salient and theoretically relevant mechanisms that might link prenatal cocaine exposure and other substance exposure to late adolescent substance use. And this model included infancy, toddler age parenting, self-regulation at preschool age, and externalizing problems at early school age. And I'm going to go through each of these steps in a bit more detail. So we know from a number of small amount of human and animal studies that cocaine interferes with maternal behavior and potentially increases the risk for more harsh maternal behaviors across early childhood. And these behaviors include a range such as angry tone of voice, expressed negative affect, displeasure, criticism, and an angry hostile mood, specifically during parent-child interactions. We also know from a large developmental literature that harsh parenting behavior is a really strong predictor of child self-regulation, which itself is a really important developmental factor. And there have been a lot of different definitions of self-regulation, but they all have a common theme of being the process of modulating behavior and affect given contextual demands. And although the regulatory processes begin to develop during the prenatal period, self-regulation involves into a pretty complex but relatively stable self-initiated process by the preschool age. And we have two related but distinct parts of self-regulation. So one is effortful control, which is the ability to suppress inappropriate behavior and perform the required appropriate behavior in response to what the environment is demanding of you. And the other one is the internalization of rules of conduct, which basically means, can you do the appropriate behavior even when no one is looking? And lower self-regulation at preschool is a consistent predictor of higher externalizing behavior problems. And those are behaviors that are more outward type. So hyperactivity, attention problems, aggression. And there's normally a decline in externalizing problems between preschool to early school age. But for the kids who don't have this decline, right, so then their externalizing behavior staying higher, it normally stays higher throughout development. And that has a number of significant risks for later developmental outcomes. In particular, continued externalizing problems, which is a very strong risk factor for adolescent substance use. So a brief pause. This is what our developmental cascade is looking like so far. And we also know from developmental literature that adolescent engagement with peers who are using substances or engaging in other delinquent behavior is also a really strong predictor of adolescents' own substance use. And we also know that parental monitoring, which is the knowledge regarding the children's whereabouts and when they're there and who they're with, is also potentially protective for adolescents' own substance use. So with that in mind, we added these two variables in early adolescence as proximal predictors of later adolescent substance use. I used a different one of Raina's samples, and this one is the maternal and child health study, which had 216 mother-child dyads recruited from birth at 2 local hospitals in the Buffalo, New York area. And the 116 with prenatal cocaine exposure were matched to 100 non-cocaine exposed, but other substances exposed based on maternal education and age. And again, we had repeated assessments. And since this is a longitudinal data that the study uses, we did formally pre-register our analysis on OSF framework. And we used a variety of multi-method assessments. I'll briefly highlight and just note that all of them are valid and reliable. So to start, prenatal substance exposure was measured with both maternal hair, urine, and self-report. Alcohol, tobacco, and joints were measured continuously based on the standard amount per week. However, due to high discrepancy on the biological and self-report with cocaine, we dummy-coded that variable. And with high bivariate correlations with maternal education at birth, with these 4 different measures, we also included it as a control in the start of our cascade. Moving along, harsh parenting and child self-regulation were measured with observational coding of lab paradigms, and externalizing problems was mother report. These had stability over time, so we were able to make some composites. And in adolescents, most of them were self-report measures, except for adolescent substance use, which also used adolescent hair report. So we were able to get in both early and late adolescence a count of the number of substances the adolescent used. And there were some folks who said no to some substances on self-report, but the hair report said otherwise. So we were able to use both of those in our measure. And looking at the beginning of our results, alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis use weren't significantly associated with maternal harshness. So I'm going to remove them for simplicity and continue to only show significant paths as we move along. So compared to the non-cocaine exposed group, the cocaine group had higher levels of maternal harshness, and maternal education had a negative association with maternal harshness. Maternal harshness, in turn, was negatively associated with child self-regulation at the preschool age, which was negatively associated with externalizing at early school age. So we had higher self-regulation at preschool was associated with lower externalizing symptoms. And that did have stability, so positively associated to externalizing at early adolescence, which then led to later adolescent substance use, and was also associated with peer delinquency at early adolescence. And then within the time of early adolescence, we had a positive association. So higher externalizing was associated with higher peer delinquency, and vice versa. Higher peer delinquency was associated with higher externalizing. Peer delinquency also had that positive time association with early adolescent substance use, which also had a positive association with early adolescent externalizing and later adolescent substance use. So the more substances used in early adolescence, the more substances used in later adolescence, emphasizing the importance of looking at both later and early predictors of adolescent substance use. And parental monitoring was negatively associated with all three of our early adolescent variables. So our key findings here are the importance of maternal harshness in the infant toddler period as a key mechanism that links prenatal cocaine exposure and child self-regulation at early preschool age, given that self-regulation then kicks off the rest of our cascade, leading to that stability and externalizing behavior all the way into adolescence. We also found that adolescents with high externalizing behaviors were more likely to engage with peers with more delinquent behaviors, which in the broader literature has been one of the strongest predictors of adolescents' own substance use. And findings also support that parental monitoring in early adolescence as a significant protective factor and way to reduce adolescents' later substance use. Our next steps is to examine early adversity as a moderator of this cascade using a cumulative risk variable from birth to kindergarten age that consists of postnatal substance use, exposure to violence, high levels of caregiver psychological distress, and caregiving instability. And why should we care about this or even include this as a moderator? Because prenatal substance exposure is often a marker of continued postnatal adversity, and these risks co-occur and also have additive impacts on child development. So we plan to test this using a multi-group analysis. We'll be able to split the sample into two, into low adversity and high adversity, and then simultaneously test this cascade for both of these groups and test each of these pathways one by one to see where these associations might differ for adolescents who were exposed to early, high levels of early life adversity versus low levels of early life adversity. And with that, I'd like to thank the parents and children who participated in this study, as well as my co-author and advisor, Dr. Rena Iden. And thank you all for listening.
All right, we have some time for questions. Certainly give you first.
Hello, I have a couple questions. First off, for I don't know where they are, but the person who presented on the vending machines. Oh, hello. Awesome work, really cool stuff. One thing that I was thinking about when you were presenting is the locations. I could be totally wrong. I don't know the locations or where you have them, but they seem to be in areas that people would kind of already have access to treatment to an extent. Obviously, you're providing like free treatment, and there's all the benefits of like non-stigmatized care and things like that you can get in sort of anonymized care. But I just sort of think about like, if I'm at an emergency department, presumably if I really need something, I could probably get it. And I'm just wondering about your plans to scale that up and thinking about possibly like more rural locations for those machines.
Yeah, perfect. Location has been something that we've thought about very carefully, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. A lot of it is accessibility in terms of like being available for others, and definitely rural expansion is something that's in our plans. We do have one vending machine that is in a somewhat rural location, Millersburg, but we did experience a lot of challenges trying to find like the right location in that community that would be accessible but also protect the vending machine. But you're exactly spot on in terms of like the right location of a vending machine impacts how people access it, and also how we're able to get items out to the community needed. So,
thank you. And then just one more thing for the last talk and the second talk here. I just had a question. Pretty much anytime you're using like a path model or some sort of mediation model, my issue with it is that, let's say you have three variables, A, B, and C. We sort of measure them as if they're not all existing at all three time points when they often are. So for example, substance use behaviors exist at A time 1, 2, and 3. Maternal harshness exists at 1, 2, and 3. And we sort of just model it as if the A to C path doesn't exist, or the A to C path doesn't exist. And you could imagine, like, let's say you have three variables and 3 time points, a 3x3 grid, where you essentially have all these potential paths that could be explaining the relationship you care about. And not only could these other paths be the actual explanatory paths, but they could control important things about the model. And it may not be that you're not finding significant effects because that's just, there's not a significant effect there. It's that it could be something like you're not controlling for substance use at subsequent time points, and that's really important. And maybe it's not prenatal substance use that is leading to parental harshness, which is leading to something else. It could be that once you control for, let's say, substance use at time 2 or time 3, you get very different effects. And I think I would just like to, and it's difficult with longitudinal surveys too, because we have access to so many measures at so many time points. But I would just like to consider that a lot of these things exist at all time points. And I think that if you can include them in your model and sort of control for these things at all time points, I think that's really important. Just sort of any thoughts there?
Yeah, thank you. Those are all really great points, some of which I originally had in there, and I ended up talking faster than I had planned to. So I guess I could have left them in. So within the model that I presented, maternal harshness is across the first 2 years of life. So it's 7, 13, and 24 months. Self-regulation is 36 and 48 months. And then externalizing was a composite from kindergarten and second grade, because those measures had really high stability, correlation, in terms of correlation and reliability. We did originally look at a model that had those time points separated out. So more maternal harshness on the top along each of those time points, and then child self-regulation, and then externalizing when it changes developmentally. And actually, I was really surprised. I thought there was going to be 2 overall pathways, but the parenting did not. It just, like, maternal harshness had stability across each time point, but it was just hanging out on its own. So we ended up taking that out of the model to save parameters, since there is so much going on and there's so many variables, which can be a con of SEM. By the time you get to the end, you've already had so much going on. But we did try to account for that. And we have done previous work that has looked at the pre to postnatal substance use on the parenting side of it. And it also did not change anything that too much. So I agree with all of your points.
I know you're in your 5th year, right? So Bayesian methods and regularization exist. So there are methods to, even with limited sample sizes, and to fit complex models with the limited information we have. So I just want to shout out, there's possibilities as well that are out there, and, contact your local methodologist for more information.
Thank you.
Other questions? Any others?
I had a question about the male rat study on the GLP-1. I was curious why you started with male rats, and also what your thoughts are on sex differences that you might anticipate.
Right. So from my understanding with like preclinical models, they typically tend to start with the male rats because you don't have to account for the estrous cycle with the female rats. So a lot of research with animal models happens, especially with rodents. They start with the males and then they go into explore female stuff. So with the females, it's hard to, I think, guess what might happen or what we might observe. But I would think that whatever we do observe probably does come back to, might have some influence on the estrous cycle, I would think. But I'm not positive at this moment. So that's why we do intend to explore the sex differences, because that is a huge component to this type of research that we're doing. So thank you.
Other questions? Have time for a few more. They're there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can have as many as you want.
So great. I have lots of questions. So I have a question for you, Rachel Wren. The parental monitoring. Tell me about that.
I'd love to.
Some ray of hope, perhaps.
Yeah. So parental monitoring, I realized I forgot to mention, I think might have had it on there. It was the child's report of parental monitoring. So a lot of literature has found that what's most predictive of the adolescent's behavior is less what the parents actually know, but what the child thinks the parent knows. So that's why we use the child's report of it. And so the questions are items like, how often, do you tell your parents who you're hanging out with, where you are, what you're doing? And even though it's the child report of it, the monitoring side of it is more of a parent process. There's another side of that, which is child disclosure. And so that's how often do you share with your parent, right? So one's how often do you tell them, maybe because they asked and they're soliciting it. The other one is I'm actively disclosing this information. And do they know where I am is the monitoring. Do I share where I am is the disclosure. So the monitoring could also be happening in other ways. They're talking to other friends' parents and the child knows that. But it can be very predictive and protective, especially during adolescence. They have this increase in unsupervised time. And so the thought is if you know that your parent knows where you are and what you're doing, you might be less likely to be doing things that we might consider more negative and more of those risk behaviors like using substances. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating to think in an age of technology what that might look like.
I was about to go. This sample was collected. Well, I guess they could have, but yeah, I was gonna say with monitoring too, especially with all the apps now, you could potentially. The child could have full-on parental monitoring with no disclosure. Like it's all being monitored through the smartphone, through apps, which I think would be really interesting. And I could definitely see that could be more of a way to parental control as opposed to the protective monitoring aspect.
If you looked at the model and just started with the cocaine use and drew a line straight to adolescent substance use, would you still have a result of any kind? And if so, how strong is it?
So taking everything out in the middle, we did not have direct associations between prenatal cocaine. I forgot you said that this morning. I'm like, yes, I'll add, and then I didn't add it in. The pressure got to me. Yes, we did not have direct associations between prenatal cocaine exposure and adolescent substance use, which the literature is pretty mixed. And a lot of the studies to add on to the mix in the literature, very few of them are longitudinal. So a lot of them are cross-sectional, meaning it's either retrospective or when they're looking at parental substance use, they're only looking at concurrent parental substance use. So while the child is 14, is the parent using substances, and they're not adding in prenatal substance exposure. So the results are kind of all over the place.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we have a question from online for Alice. It is, for the vending machines, love the project. What is the relationship with law enforcement security in these communities regarding the machines?
That's a good question. Most of the vending machines are community facing, and we have worked with local law enforcement or police in terms of this, ensuring that there wouldn't be any increased patrolling or anything to deter individuals from accessing the vending machines. In our conversations with them, they have mentioned they have their hands full, to be quite frank, that they weren't particularly interested in monitoring the vending machines. But when we do implement it, we do make sure we reach out to them to get them on board as partners, and then also kind of try to alleviate some concerns from the community.
Other questions? A few more minutes if folks still have some burning questions. Try to wait you out. But if not, we'll do 15 minutes I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule right now. So I think we'll just, in the interest of not just having some huge break right at the end of the day, I think we'll take our 15-minute break and then come back. So it's, let's see, so maybe about 3:20 or so. We'll start back up. So a few minutes early. All right. Thank you. Great presentation. We're just about ready for our final session of research talk.
Like I knew that. Thanks. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. So for our final set of research talks, excited about this last session, which is focused on policy and community related research. We've got another 4 great talks, and we'll start off with Brandy Henry, who's going to be presenting on treatment as public safety, substance use disorder services utilization, and associations with criminalized behavior during incarceration.
All right. Hi, everybody. I will try and move a little bit because I feel like I'm actually wearing glasses today, so I can see you all over there, but sometimes I'm not. I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for sticking with us. I know the energy levels are dipping. There's ice cream out there. I am Brandy Henry. I'm a co-fund with the, oh, thank you. I'll need that. With the Consortium for Substance Use and Addiction and an assistant professor in our Rehabilitation and Human Services program in the College of Education. So part of what we do there is train future clinicians, and my work sort of bridges this like practice to policy chasm. I come to it with a background having been a clinician, and this informs why I care about this topic that I think a lot of people find to be really niche, is what goes on within prisons in terms of how people continue to engage in behavior that's harmful, how we continue to criminalize things like symptoms of mental health and substance use disorders, and what we can do differently within those settings to improve public safety on the inside and outside. These are my co-authors who are not here. They're all my advisees. They come to this also with clinical backgrounds and lived experience within incarceration as well. Not all of them, but some of them. So what do we know about this topic to start with? So where are we coming into this space? So there's been kind of a lot of research over the decades looking at this idea broadly of how are things like mental health and substance use disorders associated with things like criminalized behavior, getting arrested, being incarcerated, and how can we address that through treatment instead? There was, I think, a few years ago, a really big movement around this idea, and kind of happens every 10 years or so, repackaged in different ways. How can we redistribute our resources from a policy perspective into, take them out of the justice system or punishment, move them into systems of treatment, and what kind of impact can we expect? So from that research, we know in the community, there are associations with increased things like substance use services funding through block grants, through Medicaid spending, and reductions in crime, reductions in incarceration, and not much research on the inside to see how those sorts of investment treatment services might be associated with harm, criminalized behavior on the inside. So sometimes this is new. I'm not using like crime or arrest because sometimes that happens on the inside, but usually this looks like what we call rule violations. So it might be getting into a fight, which could be an assault, but it's often things like not following the rules, having contraband in your cell, which could be like too many blankets, or it could be a weapon. So pretty big span of what these rule violation things look like. But they're sort of precursor types of behaviors to things that could be associated with like future crime. Okay. And underpinning all of this is within prison systems, we have huge numbers of people with mental health and substance use disorders. In fact, most of the people within prisons have these and or are disabled. The primary research question here is, how is utilization of behavioral health services during incarceration associated with the number of rule violations a person has while they're incarcerated? And I used the survey of prison inmates. This is a the largest survey of incarcerated people in this country. It's been conducted by funded by the Department of Justice, conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics since the 70s. They do it every 5 to 10 years. And it is a very large survey that has questions about the person's, I don't know how to make the point of work, why they were incarcerated. So what were they charged with? What's their sentence structure look like? Lots of background demographic characteristics, tons of questions about behavioral health symptoms, and some questions about services and treatment. Those indicators aren't super robust, but those are what we're working with here. And lots of questions about rule violations. How are they doing while they're incarcerated? They are all adults. They're all incarcerated in prisons. That includes state and federal prisons. It's a huge sample, so over almost 25,000 people. I'm using the most recent data, which come from 2016, but weren't released till 2020. It took them a really long time to clean it. And I've previously published off older versions of this data, which had a lot more indicators related to trauma exposure. So I have some publications on that highlight how trauma exposure mediates the relationship between mental health disorders and rule violations that I can't replicate with this new data. Although I'm on their expert survey panel, and I've been harassing them written, and this is how I ended up on the panel about why did they take those variables out? Couldn't they put them back in? And so they're like, all right, come and tell us about what measures will be in there. So I'm hopeful the next wave, which is starting next year, will have some more of those trauma indicators, because as we heard earlier, that matters a lot. But this is what we're working with. So I used the number of rule violations since someone was incarcerated as the outcome variable here. In Poisson regression models, it's a count variable, and it's highly skewed, as you might imagine, towards 0 or really low numbers. So most people haven't had too many of these, but there's less numbers of people who've had lots and lots and lots of them. So because of that data distribution, this is why I'm using this model. And then the behavioral health services are the predictors. So trying to understand how utilization of these different services are associated with the number of times people have gotten in trouble, essentially. And then I'm controlling for the presence of mental health or substance use disorders, gender, age, and race ethnicity. I don't get into it too much in this paper, but I've done some other publications with this data looking at disparities. And there are lots of disparities related to this stuff, and lots of other reasons not having to do with services utilization driving that. So that's why they're in there, but I will mention what the direction of those outcomes are, because I think it's important to keep in mind as we think about what do we do with this. So the services measures are broken up here into two different broad types. So for substance use, I'm looking at if somebody participated in, and this is self-report, so they said, yes, I participated in residential substance use services. It's really vague what most of these mean, so keep that in mind that they're kind of crude measures. I participated in counseling, detox, medication for my drug use, peer and or educational services, educational substance use services, so like psychoeducational services. Those are all since admission, and they don't ask it any other way, so that's how they're measured. For the mental health services, they ask only about two things, but they ask current and ever, and it's counseling and medication. Okay, this is just describing who's in this sample. So over here, these two are the counts or continuous variables. So I have the number of times they've gotten in trouble since admission. So at the top, it's almost 6 on average. So not that many on average, although I mentioned if you look at the distribution, there's people that like hundreds of times have gotten in trouble. And then the average age is about 40. So older population than what you would encounter in a jail setting. And then along the side, you can see demographics and then the services indicators. So most people in the sample and in prisons and jails are male and heavily skewed toward non-white, although still about a third of them identify as white. And then down at the bottom is, I think, a little bit depressing. So we can see huge proportions of people who have substance use disorders, almost half. And the mental health, I use their variable no evidence of a mental health disorder because I think it more broadly captures what that looks like instead of just directly asking someone, have you ever been diagnosed, which is a question. But this one, it also includes if they've ever had like inpatient treatment or they have like these like screening questionnaires. So this uses that, which brings people in who maybe wouldn't say straight out, I have a diagnosis or know that or think about themselves that way. What we know from this is that most people, so 43% don't have mental health problems, which means most of them do. And then if we look at the number of services or the proportion of people who are getting services, it's low, really, really low. In the case of medication-assisted treatment, only 125 people reported having that. Now, this was back in 2016, so it's, I think, increased a lot, but this is like, to me, pretty depressing. A lot of work needs to be done to like bridge this gap around care that's received in these settings. So relatively low proportions of people getting help, despite really high proportions needing it. And that doesn't even get into the quality of what those services look like, just like, this is just access. Okay. So among the people who are getting access to this, what were the associations between access and rule violations or getting into trouble? Almost wholly across the board. And I didn't exclude any services that they included as a measure. Almost all of these were significant, which is like when you're running data, super exciting. And for the substance use services, mostly as you would sort of hope or expect, that almost all of these were associated with, receipt of them was associated with less rule violations, with the exception of peer support, which was slightly higher. If you received it, you had slightly more. And there was no association with medication-assisted treatment, although as we saw before, there's likely a power issue there. There's very few people there. I'll come back to that in a second. It was a little more mixed for mental health, so mostly significant again, but kind of mixed directions in terms of the since admission services actually being associated with higher rule violations, while current mental health counseling or current medication was associated with less, and no association with current counseling. That wasn't significant. So some mixed findings there, although the counseling term I think is carrying a lot of weight. Like, what does that mean? What is the quality of that service? It varies quite a lot. And down at the bottom, you can see the demographics. So being older is associated with less, being female, and all of these racial groups as compared to white are associated with higher rates of rule violations, which is beyond the scope of this paper. But if you want to ask me questions about it, I can talk about that. All right, so here's a summary of kind of the main takeaways here. And some kind of discussion points around why I think we're seeing those associations. So the medication for addiction treatment, I think, was likely underpowered. There's only 125 people who reported receiving that. And I did run like a sensitivity analysis after this. I just did a univariate model with only that variable and the rule violations. And that was significant and associated with a reduction in rule violations, but there's a lot of correlation with that variable, as you might imagine, and receipt of other services. And so I think given the low power and the like correlation there, it sort of evaporates in the full model. But I think something to think about in terms of how like future analysis can be a little bit more nuanced around picking up some of these effects independent of each other. Let's see. So for the mental health services, it's not, I think, completely surprising that there was this sort of mixed effect. The research on between substance use disorders and arrest, criminalization, rule violations is much more direct than it is between mental health and these things. Using drugs is largely illegal. Using drugs is largely against the rules in prison. So that's a much more direct pathway to like my symptom is part of the measure. Versus mental health disorders is a lot more nuanced there. Some of my past research I mentioned is had a lot more trauma indicators to use and had a stronger association between these pathway mental health disorders and how their pathways to breaking rules are shaped by reactions to past trauma. And so that's not part of what I could get to in this because those measures are not there. Also, I think the services, I have many fewer measures. It's a lot less clear what counseling means in this setting. We know from other research around quality of these services that it's not great largely, but then there's some pockets of it where the quality is good. So it's pretty broad and varied. So this is not a great measure, but it's what there is. And there also might be a delay in these services because we're seeing more recent services having an impact versus the since admission not. So unfortunately, it's a cross-sectional study. I can't quite get to that, but that might be part of what's explaining what's going on there. For me, the main takeaway, though, is that access to substance use services is likely a really strong way to address rule violations and promote safety within settings of incarceration, and something that I have tried to incorporate into some of my service and outreach. I'm on a state commission to reduce the use of solitary confinement, and this is something that we've worked with a lot in that commission, is how to shut the front door, so to speak, of solitary confinement by increasing access to services, connection to services, screening for that, instead of just relying on incapacitation, which has been their historic approach to this. So that's where I see this going and how it matters and why I kind of keep doing this work. I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A, or you can reach out to me or any of my co-authors, and thanks for your time.
Great, thank you. All right, so and we'll again kind of hold questions until to the end for our Q&A. So for our second presentation, we have Renee Cloutier, who will be presenting baseline characteristics of Pennsylvania OTPs, foundations for MBC implementation in the Healing Measurement Center study.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you all for continuing to stick things out here. It's always good to come back to Penn State, because before I was working on this NIDA-funded HEAL initiative over at University of Pittsburgh and in the School of Medicine. Many years ago, I was a postdoc working with Stephanie Lanza as part of the PAMPT T32, and so very much always appreciate coming back and getting to reconnect with folks. And so at the University of Pittsburgh, I'm the contact multiple PI for the Healing Measures Center. And although I'm the one up here speaking today, none of this work would be possible without the other multiple PIs, Dr. Kelly Scott over at Northwestern, as well as Arnie Aldridge at RTI. This is a multi-institutional, multidisciplinary team effort, and it really takes all of us to do it. And it very much takes a full team of staff, implementation specialists, as well as administrators and research assistants to really make things happen on the ground. So just a little context about the Healing Measures Center. So we're very much focused on trying to enhance the measurement and quality of patient care that is delivered in opioid treatment programs through the implementation of measurement-based care, as well as through addressing paperwork and administrative burdens. And so our goal is to do that through 3 interrelated projects. You don't need to get into the details of it, but there's, Research Project 1, where it's focused on connecting and working with our partners, both at the provider and the local level, as well as with our state agency partners, DHS and DDAP, where we're developing an implementation blueprint for our intervention. And then we have a type 2 trial, type 2 hybrid implementation effectiveness trial with a stepped wedge framework. So just alphabet soup of trying to implement measurement-based care across 20 sites in a phased approach. And then evaluating, of course, both implementation outcomes such as adoption, fidelity, cost and cost effectiveness for the patients who engage in measurement-based care. And then project 3 is evaluating all of the potential intervention mediators as well as possible moderating variables, defining characteristics. But for today's purposes, we're really focused on, we're really going to be zoomed in on the background of the project as well as some of the initial findings that we have from Research Project 1. And I think with this group preaching to the choir, we know that it is still very much a crisis of opioid crisis. Access to treatment remains limited. Access to evidence-based treatment remains even more limited. And we know that patient-centered evidence-based treatments are needed to support people with opioid use disorder, and even more so for individuals of different identity characteristics and those that have complex and comorbid mental health needs. And measurement-based care is one framework for, or one evidence-based practice that has a lot of support within the behavioral health, mental health field, but it's the systematic use of patient-collected self-reported progress measures to guide treatment decisions at each clinical encounter. To do that with fidelity is you collect patient-reported measures, review that information, co-review that information with the patient, and use that to guide and individualize treatment behaviors. For many folks in this room, particularly if you're in psychology or counseling, it probably feels very maybe like straightforward, but it's not something that is as actively or systematically implemented out in real world settings, particularly within OTPs. And so the prior evidence base for measurement-based care is that, it's already demonstrated it's been an effective strategy for medication selection and improving the dosage, increasing the provision of personalized care, and it demonstrates improvements to symptoms when added to usual treatment. And it appears to be most effective for clients who have difficulty or who have maybe plateaued or are making limited gains within their treatment. And I know, Joel, you had asked, talking about a little bit about the treatment landscape at large and within OTPs in particular. So why measurement-based care and OTPs? So first, medication for opioid use disorder is an essential first-line treatment for individuals with opioid use disorder. Despite its efficacy, effectiveness is very much limited. Just access through geography is very limited. Less than 50% are retained at 12 months, and even less than half of that are receiving a sufficient dose. So a lot of challenges there. And yet OTPs are one of the major providers of opioid use disorder treatment. For those not familiar, only opioid treatment programs can provide methadone based off of a congressional mandate passed back in the 1970s. And so it is a very specific treatment structure that back then, occurred within a highly racialized and criminalized environment where it was very much focused on trying to ensure that if you wanted to have access to any sort of opioid use disorder treatment, which was at that time methadone, you're only going to be able to access that at an OTP where you are required to come in every single day to get a dose that is supervised. You are subjected to a certain amount of urine drug screens, a certain amount of counseling requirements. And over time, you may be able to earn your privileges, so to speak, of being able to receive take homes. But that is only after usually years of having perfect compliance within that framework. And so and that is kind of the model that has occurred within this setting over the years, remained largely unchanged up until maybe the early 2000s when buprenorphine came on the scene and it kind of expanded access to a slightly different medication access. And then in terms of how things operated within methadone clinics, that remained largely unchanged up until basically COVID, which for all the terrible things that happened there, one silver lining is that it did force some changes within the OTP setting to become more flexible, become more patient-centered, and encourage the use of make things more flexible to encourage more take-home doses, make things more patient-centered. And in 2024, SAMHSA codified those changes. So my attempt at decades of kind of where the federal and policy kind of landscape kind of changed, that highlights this also as an opportunity for encouraging the use of more patient-centered care, more evidence-based practices and patient-centered care practices, such as measurement-based care. And at the same time, in terms of measurement-based care specifically, we have major changes, endorsements from SAMHSA, CARF, and the Joint Commission. All of these are accrediting bodies that oversee the changes, crediting and quality changes that occur within the OTP setting. And within Pennsylvania, this map is very much is a little bit outdated. It lists 104 OTPs, but I know just within the past year, there have been at least 3 to 4 closures with some of the major Medicaid policy changes. But within that, we still have a large number of methadone clinics across the state. And within the Healing Measures Center, we have approximately 20% of that OTP population that have agreed to be part of the trial. So we have representation in 16 out of 67 counties. 4 of those are nonprofit or privately owned. The rest are part of larger parent organizations. And by design, they all, they're OTPs, so they prescribe methadone, but they are also designated as centers of excellence, which means that they are also providing care management and additional counseling and care coordination services. And then even within that, there's still variability. So there are some locations that have additional mental health and family support services, as well as some that continue to expand services like childcare and harm reduction programs. All of these sites are providing care for patients who are adults, teen or over, and they can be either English or Spanish speaking. And some just kind of preliminary, kind of jumping into the provider interviews that we had conducted to identify some barriers and facilitators. We did some conjoint analysis, really just to identify what total number of barriers, facilitators, what's going to be a challenge for implementing measurement-based care, what are some supports, opportunities within that, and what are things that are kind of here or there. This work lays the foundation for what becomes our implementation blueprint, where we work very closely with the providers and the leaders to kind of identify what we know to work based off of prior research, prior implementation approaches, and then just recognizing that there's going to be a unique context that we're jumping into. So some of the most common facilitators on a sample of our sites were things like they already have the technology. You know, one example is with the COVID and COVID funding, there ended up being a lot of investment in IT infrastructure, some additional kiosks, some iPads to help support telehealth or less in-person or less face-to-face screening. So we were able to so those are things that can kind of go into, well, how can we implement within our practice? We can maybe leverage some of the technology that is no longer needed for some of the more distant work that COVID required. We were very fortunate to have leadership who were already kind of who are really bought in and really invested in the value of measurement-based care. In terms of barriers, there are things that are common within healthcare in general, and particularly within OTPs, but things like staff turnover were kind of a challenge. But the things that I want to zoom in on more are for, the most common, which is MBC structure and rewards for measurement-based care. So things like kind of like the overall workflow, how do these things come together, and then how are we going to pay? Payment and incentives. How are we gonna support this? And then, of course, paperwork and administrative burdens. So something that I think that was a challenge in our partnership with, or a challenge that was consistently highlighted both by providers, but as well as patients, is just how much paperwork and how many measures are already completing on a regular basis. And it doesn't always feel like those are measures that anybody's actually following up on those things. And just feeling like they have to repeat this over and over again. So one of the challenges we had to work through is part of measurement-based care is including these patient-level assessments that are assessed more systematically. But really what we want to do is how can we identify things that are more streamlined, more efficient, and not just tack on something to an already strained workflow. So one of the pre-implementation activities that we had done was we worked with all of the providers. This is again just kind of a sample to kind of get a landscape of how much administrative burdens are we talking about, and what can we do, and kind of use that to inform our preparation work. And so one thing to note here is that we have one site that had the longest intake process, which was almost so it was over 3 hours, and it was a 2-hour difference and 191% increase from one of the shortest intake processes at site B. And so interestingly, both of these sites were within driving distance of one another, within the same city and within the same area. And so if you're a patient and you're trying to navigate this process, and you are in active opioid withdrawal, which means that you are very sick, you are not doing well, you have a difference of spending either an hour or over 3 hours before you get your first dose of methadone. And so that was something that was really important for us to take into consideration of, one, not just how do we address this within the design for the measurement-based care tool, but also working closely with the providers on how can we streamline some of these processes. And so I know we're getting short on time. So one of the things that I will highlight is really, these are things that we are actively working on right now. We are working with all 20 sites on developing these implementation blueprints. We have 3 out of 4 of the 3 out of 4 cohorts that are in active implementation right now. But I think opportunities for continued innovation, both within this project and in collaborations, are continuing to think about addressing paperwork and administrative burdens. And I know that's something that I really like to highlight in working with academic collaborators. And I know as someone who is trained in psychology, experimental psychology, where we ask the whole kitchen sink of things when we're going out into real world settings, if we can, use the methodological toolbox to identify really efficient measures, then we can really provide some support for folks providing first-line treatment, encouraging the use of standardized tools for routine assessments, and looking for ways to reduce intake processes and build more capacity. And so ultimately, we'll be implementing with 20 OTPs. We'll be collecting data on over 3,500 patients. I'm not discussing the primary outcomes here, but we'll have access to not just the patient self-reported data to be able to look at underlying mechanisms and their recovery curves over time, but also things like treatment engagement, treatment retention, and healthcare costs and healthcare utilization. But most importantly is, beyond just taking all that data and running the numbers, is working with our multi-level partners to address some of the systems level barriers, such as why do we have some of these paperwork administrative burdens? How can we address payment to reinforce the use of evidence-based practices that we know work? And then leveraging the model to continue implementing layering in other evidence-based practices in this setting, and being able to expand measurement-based care to more OTPs and non-OTP settings. And from the last talk, I was also thinking about jails and criminal justice settings for being able to effectively triage. And so we'll have a lot of really rich data that I'm really excited to be able to evaluate from a theoretical perspective and to build on with future collaborations. So if anyone has any questions, would like to collaborate or partner further, please reach out. And I'm sorry if I went over time.
Great, thank you. Next up, Christina, we've got a pair of presenters, and they'll be presenting broadband telehealth and opioid overdose mortality evidence from fiber broadband expansion in U.S. counties.
My name is Zhang. I'm a applied economist, and I'm going to present with Christina, who is a rural sociologist, on a mixed method study on the broadband telehealth and overdose death rate. I have the student also who is also here. Okay, so this actually is a nice continuation of last talk. So we talk about the COVID has been stimulate the tiny health in general, and also tiny health in the overdose in the opioid treatment. But if you want to use tiny health, then you have the broadband, the internet, good access. But fortunately, COVID also exposed this disparity in the broadband access across US. So actually, there's a huge expansion of the broadband within US post-COVID. So this graph shows you, we have really nice data from FCC, which is at every location, what is their coverage of the different broadband technologies at each house. So this graph shows you between 2022 and 2023, the percentage of households that don't have a broadband access, the fiber, because most of the broadband expansion post-COVID is fiber broadband. So this shows you the percentage on the county level, percentage of people that didn't have fiber access in 2022, then they have the access in 2023. So our average is 16% of the people actually have gained the access of fiber access in 2023. So the question is how this broadband expansion facilitate or impact the broadband overdose death rate. So again, we're going to use this method. I'm doing some data analysis, not me, actually it's my the student. And then Christina is going to do some field study and really understand what's going on. Again, the data analysis actually is relatively simple. So we basically look at between 2022 and 2023, on the county level, the percentage of people that gained the fiber access, then how is impact on the overdose death rate change the difference. I'm an economist, so if you just run the correlation, the regression, then because usually the fiber expansion is what we call endogenous. It's related to associated with a lot of other either observed or unobserved factors. So that's huge bias. Actually, if you just run this, look at the association, you say even this is insignificant, but it's positive association. Meaning if you have a higher expansion, higher fiber expansion in 2023, then you actually see a higher overdose death rate, which actually is understandable, right? Because usually those expansion, if you have higher expansion, those are the poor people. So you have the social, economically disadvantaged population. So you would say actually the overdose death rate actually increase. But again, we really want to figure out what is causal effects. So what we did is we use what we call an instrumental variable approach, which is we try to find some exogenous variable that just related to the local fiber expansion, but is uncorrelated with other local confounding factors. And then we're using this way because this is exogenous, and then we can try to identify the causal effects of the broadband expansion on the overdose death rate. So the instrument variable we use in this study was we look at what we call the secondary, which is if you look at the county, you look at the neighboring and the neighboring county of fiber expansion. Because if you look at the broadband infrastructure, think about it's very like the road infrastructure here. So you have the backbone, which is like the highway, major highway. And then you have what we call the middle mile infrastructure, which is like the road 26. That's a regional, local, but it's a major road. And then you have the last mile mileage, which is like a local road that connects to your house. But the middle mile expansion is a regional plan, right? So it's kind of overall, like across several counties, and probably don't directly correlate with the local factor. So that's what we use. So we look at the neighboring counties' fiber expansion as the instrumental variable to try to identify the causal effects of this local expansion. Again, that's kind of intuition. So what we found? So we found once we correct, as I said, if we just look at association, there's a positive correlation. But if we use this instrument variable approach, then the causal effect is negative, meaning on the county level, if in 2023, if the fiber expansion goes up, then the overdose death rate goes down. So this is the overall population, and we also look at the demographic subgroup. So the effects is most important, most significant in the non-white, and also between male and female. The male is a little bit larger. So that's kind of causal effects. But we still want to figure out what is the mechanism, right? Because again, there are two major mechanisms. One, once you have fiber expansion, the internet goes up, then it could also promote the economics growth. The economics growth, if you have better economics growth, then the overdose side could go down. And the other one is the telehealth. So we try to further separate or identify which major mechanisms that actually have this causing these effects on overdose death rate. So that's Christina's.
Yeah. All right. So as Zhang mentioned earlier, right, the results we're sharing with you today come from a mixed method study, but we're particularly using an iterative mixed methods approach. So, right, we're kind of going back and forth between our quantitative and qualitative work and back again. So Zhang has presented our base quantitative results, and now we want to know, what could be the mechanisms behind this base relationship between broadband expansion and opioid overdose mortality. So we turn to our qualitative work to explore the mechanisms, and then I'll pass it back to Zhang to use quantitative methods to more formally test the hypotheses. So for the qualitative step, we collected data in two regions. We collected data in Central Appalachia, specifically West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, and then also in the Mountain West, specifically Wyoming. And we conducted in-depth interviews with key stakeholders in these three fields here, folks who work in substance use services, other healthcare services, and economic development. And to date, we've collected 46 total interviews, but we're continuing to work on this project. And the overarching study that this work is a part of, that Zhang and I have been working on, actually kind of has two goals. And so in the interviews that myself and a graduate student, Nick Demerly, conducted, we were really exploring both of these goals, how substance use and energy dependence are connected in these counties, along with how broadband expansion is impacting substance use. But obviously in this paper we're talking about today, I'm only drawing on the data from that second goal. So, as Zhang said, based on what we know about communities' vulnerability to opioid overdose deaths, we kind of had two hypotheses for why broadband expansion might impact opioid overdose mortality. So first, we thought potentially gaining access to broadband could help people gain access to telehealth. So it'd be improving access to treatment. But our competing hypothesis was whether broadband expansion was potentially increasing local economic opportunity. So that would allow people to have broader access to recovery capital. It might decrease initiation of use. So these were what we wanted to unpack in our interviews. And overwhelmingly, our interviews provided evidence for the access to treatment through telehealth hypothesis and not the economic opportunity hypothesis. So across our interviews, participants really spoke to how telehealth had created new pathways to treatment engagement in their communities. If I didn't mention it earlier, these were mostly rural providers. So these are rural providers in the Mountain West and Appalachia. So they found that there was considerable interest among the people they served in using telehealth services, right? So in these areas where the providers were located, typically there are few providers. They're often very physically far away from residents of the counties. There's little public transportation infrastructure. Stigma is still high towards seeking treatment. There's low anonymity, right? So in going to a local provider, often you're going to know other people there or even people that work there. And so they found, providers found that offering telehealth had lowered those barriers, and that was very desirable to some of their clients that they served. Of course, existing literature talks a good bit about how seeking treatment via telehealth can be especially desirable among mothers with young children, not requiring as frequent trips to seek in-person care. And our participants definitely reiterated that. We heard that among our participants, But in these rural contexts, they also pointed to some particular reasons why they found their male clients also really appreciated the option for telehealth. So kind of among local like cultural norms that, disincentivized help seeking among men or discouraged men from opening up. Providers explained to us that they felt like men felt more comfortable seeking care in this way. We also learned that being able to benefit from telehealth usually still requires, some in-person entry point in these communities, right? So rarely were providers talking to us about initiating treatment with clients in this way, but instead, folks had to visit in-person care first to then be offered this opportunity. And so what that is telling us is that, telehealth might not be offering new on-roads to treatment for folks in these communities, that it's just kind of helping to sustain engagement. All right, so I want to turn to the second hypothesis in service of time. Right, so this was the hypothesis about whether or not broadband expansion could be creating new local economic opportunity. And participants, especially those working in economic development, really told us that they hadn't seen this happening at all yet in their communities, right? That often these specific communities in their counties that lacked good broadband service also lacked other types of infrastructure, right? They didn't have good water service. They didn't have good wastewater service. So suddenly having broadband wasn't going to help them all of a sudden recruit new employers. They also didn't find that it was really being used for remote work possibilities among local residents, right? Some of these economic development groups were trying to bring new folks in from cities to come work in their remote jobs in these communities, but it wasn't creating new opportunities for folks who were already living there. So really, we found that providers did not think that this economic opportunity hypothesis was viable yet.
Yeah, so I'm going to just briefly talk about the data results, kind of consistent with Christina's insights. So this table just basically shows you the effects of the fiber expansion on those social economic status. We talk about unemployment, poverty, and medium household income. So there's no significant effects, and it's in short term. Then what we did is we did couple further analysis. One, we separate states that with the tiny house reimbursement priority from those without, because this is states that are more friendly to the tiny house. And then we find the significant results for the county that in the states that are friendly or try to promote tiny house, but no effects on those other states. And the other one is we separate county with those county with the local treatment facility that are actually offering a tiny house versus those nice. And then we also find the effects are more significant for the county that has the local treatment facility that are actually offering the tiny house. So again, this is consistent with people say, or the insight that the tiny house and the in-person visit, they are supplements, not the substitutes. They're complements, not substitutes.
Yeah. Wrap it up. All right. So to quickly wrap it up, right? We are finding evidence, and we say causal evidence that broadband expansion, has these important impacts on overdose mortality. And so we think that this means that there's also evidence that broadband expansion could be impacting access to other types of healthcare services. But right now we're interested in expanding this to kind of look at some other outcomes. For example, we're interested in seeing whether if we repeat these methods, would we see similar impacts on, for example, deaths by suicide? And based on our interviews so far, we're not totally sure that we would see that, right? Just because broadband's suddenly available doesn't mean that people are using telehealth for all services right away without any kind of motivation or incentive or on-ramp on. We also obviously are finding that there are still barriers to adoption among a number of specific populations, older adults, those with really limited resources. And so interventions are still needed there. And then I want to highlight one other important factor that has come up a lot in our interviews, and that is economic development practitioners in particular have been wanting to talk to us a lot about their concerns about the sustainability of broadband access or accessibility of broadband, right? With all of these federal subsidies, broadband has been relatively affordable for companies to get set up. Therefore, rates are affordable for people who live there. But in these really remote communities, there's concern that in the long run, as subsidies disappear, rates could rise for local rural residents. And so therefore, even if broadband's available, people might not be as connected, and therefore will some of these benefits we've seen disappear. And so that is kind of at the top of practitioners' minds, and they're hoping others are thinking about that as well. All right, so our contact information is here. If you want to chat about this any further with us, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk.
All right, our last, but certainly not least, we've got Elizabeth Long, who's going to be presenting on lawmakers' use of substance use research can be improved at scale, a randomized clinical trial.
Nothing like being last. Thank you all for sticking around. My name is Beth. I'm an assistant research professor and director of research and evaluation at the Research Translation Platform within the Evidence to Impact Collaborative here at Penn State, which is a mouthful, and I recognize that. But today I'm going to present on some early exciting results that's coming out of an ongoing trial that we have of a strategy to increase policymakers' use of research evidence regarding substance use policies. So I think everyone here can agree how essential it is that the important research that's being done and is being done on substance use reaches policymakers so that they can use it to inform policy. This need has been increasingly recognized by the scientific community and policymakers alike, but the question of how to bridge the gap between research and policy remains. So one way to foster more routine use of research evidence in policymaking is to build infrastructure, to build relationships between researchers and policymakers. With that in mind, we developed a model called the Research to Policy Collaboration Model. This was designed as an infrastructure building model that embeds mechanisms for sustained engagement between researchers and policymakers based on the theory pointing to the importance of relationship-centered models for supporting research use and policy. So I won't go through all of it, but briefly, implementation of the model begins with identifying policymakers' needs and priorities for substance use, and then inviting researchers from our rapid response network to respond to those requests for research, and then finally facilitating a meeting between them so that they can share their research with the policymakers, all with the goal of establishing an ongoing collaboration. Results from a prior experimental trial at the federal level demonstrated that congressional offices randomized to receive the RPC model reported greater value of conceptual research use than control offices who received light touch research support, which basically means that they just received publicly available research materials rather than the structured engagement with researchers that those in the RPC model received. And then also 23% more RPC offices introduced bills containing research than control offices. But it's not clear yet whether the RPC model can be scaled to state legislatures in a different topic area. This one focused on child and family research, and the question remained whether we could scale it to a different topic area. So the work I'm going to present on today draws from a trial testing the impact of the RPC model on substance use policy across US state legislatures. So specifically, the work tested the effectiveness of the RPC model on increasing the use of research in overdose prevention bills. And we also explored moderation by naloxone prescribing rates, which were chosen because we thought that they would serve a more proximal indicator of the intervention effects rather than a more distal outcome, such as overdose deaths, which may take longer to see an impact on. So this was done within a clustered randomized control trial where 20 state legislatures were randomized to receive either the RPC model or to the control condition in which they received the light touch research support, similar to the federal trial. And the primary outcome was research use in overdose prevention bills introduced after the implementation began. So bills introduced between January and April 2025 were searched for their relevance to substance use and their use of research. Use of research was measured using linguistic markers that were adapted from our prior work, and it was treated as a binary variable. In total, we analyzed 217 bills to compare the likelihood of overdose prevention bills. And then we also considered the moderation effect of naloxone prescribing rates. For the analyses, the primary analysis compared the likelihood that overdose prevention bills introduced in intervention states versus control states contained references to research using a mixed effects logistic regression model with bills nested within states to account for clustering. And then a moderation analysis was also conducted that tested the interaction between naloxone prescribing rates and research use in bills. Results showed that intervention states had almost 3 times greater odds of including research in overdose prevention bills than control states, with 78% of overdose prevention bills introduced in RPC states, including markers of research, compared to only 52% of bills from control states. And then this effect was moderated by naloxone prescribing rates within the state, such that intervention states that introduced more bills using research having higher naloxone prescribing rates, whereas control states' use of research did not vary by prescribing rates. These results were really exciting to us because they demonstrate that the RPC model can significantly increase the use of research in state legislation regarding overdose prevention policies. And these findings also extend the previous experimental results from Congress to the state level, suggesting that the RPC model can be successfully scaled to diverse policymaking environments. And for the first time, we demonstrate a relationship between the RPC model's effects in an actual public health practice, which provides support for the theory that research-informed policymaking can actually translate into real-life public health impacts. So I feel like mine was quicker than others, but in sum, I wish to leave you with 2 key takeaways. First, infrastructure building strategies that support the Infrastructure building strategies that support routine researcher engagement and structured relationships can strengthen evidence-informed policymaking at scale across different levels of government. And then second, improvements in evidence-based policymaking can translate into real-world public health impacts. Together, I think these can yield significant improvements to substance use outcomes and save lives. And I wish to thank the other authors on this work, and the paper was just accepted to the American Journal of Public Health as of Friday, so I was excited to say product under the National Institute of Drug Abuse.
All right, I think we've got time for some questions for any of the presentations.
Thank you. I just had a question for the broadband folks. Is it clear whether overdose rates are going down or if those people are just moving because they're getting gentrified and they can't afford to live there anymore?
Because this is the data between in 2022 and 2023. So overall, the overdose actually goes up. But just saying the mitigation effects of both, so actually increase nice. So this is how you interpret the results.
Could you repeat that?
The mitigating. So so for the count, if you have a higher broadband expansion, then the overdose death rate is not decreased as much as other counties.
But couldn't that just be because those people move and then they don't overdose in that place because they're not there anymore?
That's good point, because I didn't have time to talk through the specific, but we do control like the population different demographics as a control variable. So that's basically control
population count,
the difference. So that's kind of measure of the migration. Or
So if one person moves in, one person leaves, that doesn't change anything though, which is often common in gentrification because people are moving in with money and then people who are poor are leaving.
Yeah. Well, so that can be remedied by looking not just at population count, but how, changes in the demographic composition, changes in demographic composition in other ways, like income level, race, which they look at. Also, these areas that are mostly seeing expansions in broadband, they are areas that tend to be pretty disadvantaged. And I would not say they're all of a sudden being gentrified. They're still really remote places that have really, fairly low populations overall. And they're gaining broadband, but other places have access to that already. So I wouldn't say that in this small time period, these communities really see something that would be akin to gentrification. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Beth's presentation, actually. So I think that's really cool that you were able to replicate the effect of the RPC work, not just at the federal level, but down to the state level. As we look at, I guess, have you all explored how the model might apply it to a more local level, say at the counties? In theory, for like opioid settlement funding, where there's a lot more local driven decision making?
We have proposals in development that is looking to extend the RPC model to the agency level, where we're going to be submitting that to the National Institute of Child Health and Development coming up. And then I'm sure other local level counties will be next. We started at the top and then working our way down.
Steps. Thank you. I know that there are a lot of threads that can be pulled upon with each one of these studies. I think it's Brandy that I wanted to speak with. Or speak to with the 1 to 3 hour intake assessment. There you go. No, I'm sorry. I got my names screwed up on here. Did you find, I spent 12 years working at FUHC and JACO rules the day, right? Among other bureaucratic hoops that we have to jump through. Did you find that was more cumbersome with site-specific bureaucracy like JACO? Like Johns Hopkins says, we're not playing ball. We don't have to. We're Johns Hopkins. Keep your accreditation. Did you notice that there was a correlation if that was studied? Like I said, there are 1,000 threads that could be pulled upon.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
good knows.
No, that is a really great question. And so I didn't go into kind of like the depths of what we had done. So we kind of just showed like the highlight takeaway of like how much time that was taking and how much variability there was. But we also had done an additional step of crosswalking all of the measures in all of the domains against DEA, SAMHSA, DDAP sodas, CARF and the Joint Commission kind of guidelines. And what we found really is more so than correlation against those different accrediting agencies is a lot of it is just particularly for the older agencies or agencies that go through a lot of different iteration, like pass through a lot of different hands. Again, this is all very, very preliminary, but there's a lot of historical measures that instead of, saying, maybe a new leadership comes in or a policy changes, instead of taking things away, things just get tacked on. And similarly, like if one agency gets dinged in one audit one time about one particular thing, they may, like in an attempt to respond to or correct that particular thing, they add additional things. And so then you have just a history of measures and processes that aren't really serving any of the, like any specific current policy, but they've just accumulated over time, and then they get really, it's really difficult to change, that people get resistant to change because they're like, there's one time back in 1987 when someone like when we almost lost our license. And so that's a lot of what we see, if that makes sense.
Insurances.
Oh, yes. Actually, I will say there is definitely variability across the payer and managed care organizations and their policies and the concerns about their kind of clawback processes and structures.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question for Christina. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about your study design of the mixed method. How did you sequence it and how, why?
Yeah, sure. So Zen and I have been working on a few projects together in a mixed methods fashion. But essentially, we've kind of used the same process with all of our work together, which is that we have a research question and we look at initial trends quantitatively, and then think of maybe we're trying to explore mechanisms behind the trend using qualitative methods. In this case, we were able to think of, is there a way to like actually formally test the mechanisms that we came up with through the qualitative work? So we kind of just use this back and forth process where we're not carrying this work out, separately behind a closed door, but instead like have regular meetings to think through, what have participants told me? How can we test this, right? So like thinking about the demographic subgroups is a great point. Zen and Mungjun are finding specific differences among men and women or across age groups. And they can say, hey, can you weave these questions into your interviews from now on? I do very unstructured interviews. I have goals, but I'm willing to like take my interview guide and add a new question that I'm going to add into like this next subsample of folks in future interviews. And so by having this kind of back and forth, it allows us to evolve as the research continues.
Other questions? Actually, Brandy, I might ask you a quick one. I don't know if you either have or have considered dividing up the rules violations into sort of categories, because you talked about that there's a wide range of what those might entail, from sort of pretty serious offenses to sort of more minor infractions.
Yes. So the current study that I proposed or was showing you all is in sort of early phases, which I find is useful. You get ideas like this. I have in some of my other analysis of this current data set and older versions of it looked at those sorts of things. So I think the first time I looked at that, I broke it into like major and minor and then drug. Obviously, like really strong relationship between substance use disorders and using drugs, which you're not supposed to be doing. And some surprising relationships between serious mental illnesses and major rule violations, where there's like this long discourse around how, I think for a long time we thought of those as more like organic, like neurobiological disorders, which weren't as rooted in trauma. Although when my work was looking at these associations between trauma and serious mental illness and then criminalized behaviors, which we there's like this narrative around symptoms being criminalized. When you controlled for the trauma, there was actually no relationship between serious mental illness and major rule violations. And then some work coming out around trauma at the same time, trauma being a really strong predictor of those disorders and kind of reframing how we think of that, which I think says a lot about like how to like what do we do about this? How do we bring in like a trauma informed care or trauma competent care, someone said earlier, to restructure how we deal with people so we don't trigger those symptoms. And so, yeah, I think it looks like differently when you break it out. I also I have a problem of getting too into let's look at it this way and that way. And at some point you kind of like have to like move along. So I think that's, yeah, like zooming in and out is super important in terms of like, how do we, because as I said, in like when I'm talking to policymakers around this, what do we do about this? They love to assess people with these screeners and instruments and then match them to these targeted units, which I used to work on some of these. And so they care quite a lot about like, okay, well, which rule violation do I like send them to unit A for? And what do I do in unit A? Who works there? So I think, yeah, getting into the weeds is it matters. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks. Any other sort of final questions? Yeah.
Question for you. I was curious if you looked at any of the synthetic cannabinoids that are coming in or have been kind of famously watched at some of the media recently into the Cook County jails. But I can't really. I think I can think of easily 3 or 4 state systems that have been sort of dealing with some of these rule violations and other activities. But curious if you have research or thinking about this and how, especially with respect to medication treatment.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the data that I was presenting to you all doesn't have any questions about that, but partially, they do ask a lot of questions about drugs you've used before you got to prison. The most recent version's not so recent and doesn't have that kind of stuff. And I think they might include some of those in the newer version, but it's like, it's so outdated by the time you can use it that it's not so useful. But in my like more outreach work that I was talking about, it's like the state commission. This is something that we talk about a lot. And so this is a interdisciplinary committee that has like, it's actually in Massachusetts. So that there's a jail representative who's the superintendent out in Western Massachusetts. And this is a big issue. Why he says he doesn't want to stop using solitary confinement because he needs to address this problem. It's killing people in his jails. They're overdosing on stuff. So like navigating that question, I think is really important. And so this is where I think bringing research in is super useful. Like, okay, well, how can we it's there. How can we treat the people and help them move past whatever their symptoms are so they don't end up hurting people like you're worried about? And I find that to be like useful to kind of decharge the emotional tension that people get so stuck on, like I observed this or that. So to bring in some evidence, but like think over here, we're talking about like you need a relationship to be able to challenge someone like that. So yeah, I think that this is really part of the current conversation, and how can we bring in data to bear on that is really important.
Any other questions? All right. If not, I'm going to say a couple of final thank yous. So first of all, thank you to all of our presenters, all of our participants. Really appreciate it. I think this was a wonderful day. Also a huge thank you to our staff. So Melissa, Robin, I know Christy, Natasha, I saw Carmen out there too. So a huge thank you for putting this all together, especially behind the scenes. This was great. And Mark, Mark, I'm literally behind the scenes back here. So thank you to all the help putting this together. Again, thank you to all of our presenters. Thanks to everyone for coming out, especially, I'm preaching to the choir here of the folks that stayed till the end. We have some ice cream outside as a final thank you. And again, thank you. And always appreciate everyone coming and participating so much. Thank you. Yeah. One more thing. We have so thank you to I'm gonna try to just stall for time for a second. So thank you to all of our poster presenters. These were excellent. We had some judges going around and asking questions, and we have a couple of certificates for those that stood out to our judges. And again, I'll just try to waste time. All right. So our first poster award goes to Jasmine Pabla. Jasmine still here? Now we will be sure to. Our second one goes to Thor Larson. Congratulations. Do you want?
Yeah, we can do pictures at the end.
Meng Jun Gi, I think. And Tasnia Biswas. And then our last poster award goes to Sinhuja Bhaskar. Make sure that makes it to its rightful. So that really concludes our conference. Again, thank you to everybody. We'll have our poster winners maybe come up for a final photo. And again, thank you and enjoy some ice cream.